Helix Gate Medical Station did not merely orbit the glass rift. It dangled over it like a metallic lure cast into the maw of a starving god. The rift was a localized tear in space-time, a jagged, luminous wound in the dark, where the fundamental laws of physics curled up and died. Down there, the universe lied with malicious intent. Medical telemetry would routinely glitch, reporting a heart rate of 4,000 beats per minute or a body temperature hovering near absolute zero, just to keep the night shift terrified. The station groaned constantly, its titanium bones protesting the shifting gravity tides. Chief Medical Officer Thales Vorn, a being composed mostly of luminous bioelectric plasma encased in a heavily pressurized biosuit, was just finishing hour 47 of a grueling 48-hour shift. His internal currents hummed a soothing, dim azure, anticipating the quiet peace of the recharge stasis. He was reviewing the supply manifest, noting they were down to 15 units of synthetic plasma, when the klaxons screamed. It was a code crimson, a priority override from the salvage teams working the debris fields near the edge of the rift. Thales flowed toward the primary diagnostic terminal, his tendrils flying across the haptic interface. Data streamed down the holographic display, flashing in jagged, angry red geometries. Species classification human. That single word was enough to induce a localized migraine. Deathworlders were notoriously difficult to treat, mostly because their chaotic biology treated massive physical trauma as a personal insult rather than a structural failure. The automated telemetry read like a post-mortem report for a heavy industrial accident. Severe extravehicular activity suit breach on multiple composite layers. Class 4, cold radiation burns spanning 30% of the dermal surface. Microfractures spiderwebbing across the spinal column, extending violently from the lumbar region up to the cervical vertebrae. Substantial internal hemorrhaging in the abdominal cavity. But the worst metric was the neurological scan. Severe, cascading nerve damage was tearing down the entire right leg, suggesting the primary neural pathways had been simultaneously flash-fried by anomalous energy and then flash-frozen by the void. By all established galactic medical standards, the subject was meat. The human should be in a state of terminal physiological shock, assuming his central nervous system had not already surrendered and shut down the heart entirely. Then, Thales saw the addendum at the bottom of the report, typed rapidly by a bewildered triage drone operator. Patient walked into the emergency bay unassisted. Made a joke. Thales's bioelectric aura spiked instantly into a harsh, crackling violet. That was impossible. It had to be a translation error, or a temporal glitch bleeding up from the rift. A bipedal organism with that degree of lower body neural destruction could not ambulate. It defied biomechanics. The heavy blast doors of Trauma Bay 7 hissed open, protesting loudly against the sudden pressure differential. The figure that stood in the threshold looked less like a living patient and more like a casualty of an orbital bombardment. Oren Mercer was half-coated in the signature obsidian grit of the glass rift, the crystalline dust actively eating into the remaining fabric of his ruined environmental suit. His right leg dragged behind him with the heavy, dead weight of a discarded anchor. Where the suit had sheared open at the thigh and torso, blood was actively freezing into crimson, sedimentary layers, cracking and reforming with every agonizing, shuddering step he took. The smell of ozone, scorched polymers, and the heavy copper scent of human blood flooded the sterile air of the bay. The ambient atmospheric sensors immediately began wailing about biohazard contamination. But Thales ignored them. He was too captivated by the sheer, grotesque defiance of physics unfolding in front of him. The human was breathing, raggedly, wetly, drawing in shallow, desperate gasps. But he was breathing. Oren did not collapse onto the floor. He did not scream for intravenous anesthetics. He did not plead for his mother or his gods. He braced a heavy, gauntleted hand against the pristine white doorframe, leaving a thick smear of freezing red, and looked directly at the bioelectric chief medical officer. "Does anyone here have the reaction core map of the station?" Orin asked. His voice was a rusted blade, scraping against a tombstone, tight with a level of pain that should have shattered his mind hours ago. To Thalus's left, Nurse Nema Sile made a sound like tearing wet silk. Nema was a Sylphian. On her homeworld, the atmospheric pressure was soft. The temperatures were uniformly pleasant, and the evolutionary path had never required endurance against hostility. For her species, a moderate contusion was enough to trigger a self-protective, coma-like state that could last for 2 weeks. The sheer proximity to the radiating, invisible agony rolling off the human was causing her semi-translucent green skin to ripple with sympathetic panic. She was quite literally melting under the psychological weight of his sustained consciousness. "By the ancestral tides," Nema whispered, her voice trembling so violently she could barely form the standard galactic syllables. "He is awake. Why is he awake? The pain receptors should have severed his consciousness. The brain should be dormant to protect the organic processor." Thalus did not answer her. He raised his upper manipulator tendrils, projecting a localized deep tissue scan directly over Orin. The holographic readouts materialized in the air between them, confirming the initial telemetry and then making the reality infinitely worse. The nerve damage in the right leg was not just severe, it looked like a fractal map of a lightning strike burned into his flesh. The pain signals rocketing up the human spinal cord were so intense, they were creating localized electromagnetic interference, causing the scanner image to flicker and static. If any other sentient species in the known galaxy suffered this specific configuration of neural trauma, they would be permanently paralyzed, at the absolute optimistic best. Their brains would simply amputate the limb from their internal neural map to save the core consciousness from burning out. But the human was standing. The human was talking. The human was asking about engineering schematics, while his body screamed in the language of dying nerves. Orin pushed off the doorframe with a grunt. Every muscle in his jaw corded with extreme tension as he dragged himself toward the central examination table. He did not wait for Nema or Thalus to assist him. He hoisted himself up, the ruined right leg thudding against the sterile metal like a piece of dead, waterlogged wood. He looked at Nema, who was hyperventilating and backing away, then looked back at Thalus. Orin offered a smile. It was a terrifying, haunting expression, lopsided and strained, pulling tightly against skin that was gray, with hypovolemic shock and streaked with black glass dust. It was the smile of a stubborn creature that had looked directly into the abyss, spat in its eye, and crawled back out of pure, unfiltered spite. Thalus prepared a massive dose of standard neural dampeners, his internal processors calculating the exact milligram count needed to shut down a Deathworlder's hyperactive nervous system without stopping his oversized, stubbornly beating heart. The synthesized liquid glowed a pale yellow inside the delivery module. Orin saw the auto-injector powering up at the end of Thalus's tendril. The human's eyes, wide, bloodshot, and fever-bright, locked onto the bioelectric alien. The casual demeanor evaporated instantly. "Don't put me under deep anesthesia," Orin said, his tone shifting from casual inquiry to a dead, heavy seriousness that dropped the ambient temperature of the room by 10 degrees. "Your neural pathways are literally burning themselves out." "Human." Thalus buzzed through his vocal synthesizer, the sound sharp, clinical, and authoritative. "Your pain threshold is a biological lie fueled by adrenaline. If you remain conscious for another 5 minutes, your mind will snap and the damage will be irreversible." Orin reached out with astonishing speed, his trembling, blood-stained hand gripping Thalus's injector arm, forcing it down. The human leaned forward, the freezing blood cracking loudly on his chest plate. "I said no deep sleep," Orin repeated, his gaze burning with a terrifying, absolute certainty. "Local blocks only. Keep me awake. If I sleep too long, everyone on this station will die, Thalos retracted the auto-injector, his internal biocurrents pulsing a troubled, dim orange. The human's grip had been weak, trembling with tectonic exertion, yet possessed an ironclad finality. Yielding to a patient's delirious demands, went against every protocol hardwired into the chief medical officer's crystalline matrix. But the sheer gravitational pull of Oren's conviction forced a compromise. Local blocks only, Thalos buzzed, recalibrating the chemical synthesizer. But I must perform a comprehensive deep tissue resonance scan. Your physiology is currently a crime scene, and I need the entire timeline. Oren released his grip, his head falling back against the sterile padding of the examination table. His chest heaved. Knock yourself out, Doc. Just keep the lights on upstairs. The medical bay dimmed as Thalos activated the overarching resonance ring. It descended from the ceiling, a halo of pale green light that washed over the ruined human form, stripping away the visual obstruction of flesh and blood to project a horrific, three-dimensional topographical map of Oren's internal architecture. Thalos stared at the holographic projection, and his bioplasma went completely cold. The right leg was a biomechanical nightmare. It was not merely a matter of kinetic trauma. The femur, tibia, and fibula were webbed with microfractures, but the neural pathways wrapping around them defied all linear logic. There were hundreds of distinct nerve fissures. They appeared to have been systematically flashbaked by intense thermal radiation, then instantly subjected to cryogenic freezing, over and over again. It looked less like an injury sustained in a singular catastrophic void exposure, and more like a limb that had been forged in a malfunctioning star down an assembly line of torture. This is biologically impossible, Thalos muttered, his tendrils tracing the glowing red lines of ruined nerves. These thermal and cryogenic signatures, they are layered, as if you were exposed to a stellar flare, then hard vacuum, then another flare, sequentially. The tissue should be necrotic ash. It feels like it, Oren rasped, his eyes squeezed shut. Try not to poke the charred bits. Nima, having managed to suppress her terror enough to monitor the fluid extraction, let out a sharp, clicking gasp. She had drawn a vial of the human's blood to check for sepsis, expecting a sludge of dying cells and crystalline debris. Instead, she was staring at the magnification screen with wide, horrified eyes. Dr. Vorn, the Sylphian nurse choked out. The obsidian particulate matter in his bloodstream. It is not environmental contamination from the rift. Thalos shifted his visual receptors to her monitor. The black glass dust that coated Oren's exterior had penetrated deep into his circulatory system. But, under microscopic analysis, the particles were not jagged shards tearing up his veins. They were moving with horrific, geometric purpose. The microstructures were actively clustering around the torn vascular walls and shattered bone fragments, linking together in perfect hexagonal lattices. They were functioning as a self-assembling, living splint, forcibly holding the human's breaking body together from the inside out. Active nanoscaffolding, Thalos hypothesized, though he had never seen tech quite like this. It resonated with the same bizarre frequency as the anomalous zone outside the station. Before he could process this terrifying symbiosis, the overarching scanner finished its sweep of Oren's abdominal cavity. The projection updated, and Thalos physically recoiled. The human's internal organs, the liver, the kidneys, the robust muscular walls of his heart, displayed varying degrees of ischemic shock and blunt force trauma. But the bruising and cellular degradation were not synchronous. Some contusions were fresh, bleeding profusely. Others showed advanced stages of cellular necrosis, typical of injuries sustained days ago. Yet another layer displayed rapid, anomalous regeneration. It was a paradox written in meat. It looked as though this single human body had been violently killed in 3 different environments, and then haphazardly stitched back into one localized timeline. Administering localized neural deadening to the lower extremities, Thalos announced. desperate to establish some baseline of medical control over this walking impossibility. He fired a micro dart into Oren's thigh. Almost instantly, Oren thrashed upward, slapping his own leg with a heavy, bloody hand. "No, stop, dial it back. Doc, leave the upper sciatic nerve open." Thalos was astounded. "That pathway is currently broadcasting a level 9 pain signal. It is agonizing. Why would you—" "Because the pain is shifting," Oren interrupted, his breathing erratic. He was staring at his own leg, as if it were a compass needle. "It is not just hurting. It is moving, like a dial turning." Nima shrank back against the supply cabinet. "He is experiencing profound neurocognitive dissociation. Delirium." "I am not crazy, you transparent glowstick," Oren snapped, though his voice lacked malice, only sheer desperation. He grabbed the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white beneath the grime. He locked his feverish gaze onto Thalos. "Listen to me. In exactly 11 minutes, the artificial gravity in the entire East Corridor is going to drop to 0 for exactly 6 seconds. Then, it will slam back to normal. If you have any medical drones carrying fragile isotopes over there, ground them right now." The medical bay fell into a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the rhythmic, wet sound of the human's breathing. Thalos looked at Nima. Nima looked at Thalos. Post-traumatic hallucination was a documented side effect of severe neurological trauma, especially in Deathworlders whose brains tried to rationalize sensory overload by fabricating external phenomena. "Noted, Mr. Mercer," Thalos said, adopting a soothing, clinical tone meant to pacify a crumbling psyche. "I will inform station control. Please, lie back." Oren let out a harsh, barking laugh that dissolved into a wet cough. He let his head fall back onto the table. "You do not believe me. Fine. Just watch the clock. Doc." Thalos ignored the ravings. He needed to understand the neurological mechanism keeping this creature awake. He adjusted the overarching scanner, narrowing the resonance field to penetrate the human's thick, primitive skull and map the cerebral cortex. The holographic brain materialized. Thalos leaned in, his internal plasma flickering with sudden, acute dread. The human brain was a chaotic storm of electrical activity, which was standard. But beneath the surface noise, Thalos detected a pattern. Deep within the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex, there were distinct, recurring electrical scars. They were perfectly uniform, spaced evenly across the neural tissue. In galactic neuroscience, such scarring only occurred under one specific condition, when a synthetic memory engram was violently written, erased, and rewritten over the exact same localized cluster of neurons. It was the footprint of an overwritten mind. Thalos stared at the shifting black microstructures in the blood. He looked at the contradictory, time-layered trauma on the internal organs. He looked at the electrical scars branding the brain. A terrifying hypothesis began to form in the chief medical officer's analytical mind. This human was not merely a survivor of a freak salvage accident. The severe physiological anomalies, the impossible survival, the shifting pain that he treated like a sensory instrument. Oren Mercer was neurologically synchronized with the localized time-space distortions of the glass rift. Thalos checked the chronometer on his visual display. 10 minutes and 58 seconds had passed since the human's prediction. 10 minutes and 59 seconds. 11 minutes. A violent, sickening lurch echoed through the titanium bones of Helix Gate. The sound was not an explosion, but the terrifying groan of structural torsion. Inside the medical bay, several unsecured scalpels floated gracefully upward from the surgical tray, hanging suspended in midair. Nima let out a shriek as her own feet left the floor, her lightweight body drifting upward. Thalos, anchored by his heavy biosuit, felt his internal fluids rush toward his upper canopy. On the primary monitoring screen, The internal security feed of the East Wing displayed absolute chaos. Cargo containers drifted lazily toward the ceiling. Maintenance drones spun out of control. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 4 seconds, 5 seconds, 6 seconds. Gravity slammed back into existence with the force of a hammer strike. The scalpels clattered harshly onto the floor. Nima landed hard on her knees, gasping. On the security feed, the drifting cargo crates crashed down, shattering floor tiles and crushing 2 automated rovers. The medical bay was dead silent once more, save for the hum of the overarching scanner. Thalos slowly turned his visual receptors back to the examination table. Orin had not moved. He lay flat on his back, staring blankly up at the harsh white ceiling lights. His lips were a bloodless, pale gray. He did not look smug about being right. He looked like a man standing at the bottom of a very deep, very dark well, listening to the water rise. "I wasn't in one accident," Orin whispered. The sheer exhaustion in his voice was heavier than the gravity that had just returned. "I have failed more times than you think." The air in Trauma Bay 7 felt thick enough to choke on. The environmental scrubbers hummed, trying to filter out the metallic tang of adrenaline and the ozone reek of the rift. But the atmosphere remained oppressive. Thalos extended a primary manipulator, his luminescent core dimming into a severe, interrogative indigo. "Start talking, Mercer," the chief medical officer demanded, the synthetic voice sharp enough to cut titanium. "I need the exact sequence of events. Do not omit a single detail. What did your salvage team find out there?" Orin dragged his gaze away from the ceiling. He swallowed dryly, his throat clicking in the quiet room. "A derelict. Not a ship. A structure. It was just drifting along the edge of the distortion field. No transponder. No engine wash. No known architectural profile. We breached the outer hull using thermal lances." He paused, his breathing shallow, as the localized nerve blockers waged a losing war against the shifting agony in his flesh. "Inside, the architecture was wrong," Orin continued, his voice a gravelly whisper. "Non-Euclidean, corridors that bent back on themselves. In the center, there was a chamber holding an arc-shaped machine. The material was pitch black, swallowing the light from our shoulder lamps. It did not look built. It looked grown." Thalos recorded every syllable, cross-referencing the description with the station's xenology databases. "Zero matches." "And then," Nima prompted, her voice barely above a squeak. She was clutching a diagnostic slate to her chest like a physical shield. "My team lead, Kalen, ran a proximity scan," Orin said, his eyes darkening at the memory. The machine was dormant, cold. "So he reached out and touched the inner curve of the arc to take a metallurgical sample." Orin's chest heaved. A tremor ran through his right arm. The moment his glove made contact, the floor did not just shake. Reality vibrated. It felt like a massive bell being struck. But the sound was inside our skulls. The air turned heavy, tasting like copper and ash. "Something on the other side of that glass woke up." "How did you escape?" Thalos pressed, leaning closer. "The telemetry from your suit shows massive catastrophic failure across all life support systems simultaneously." Orin frowned, a look of profound frustration twisting his pale features. "I do not know. I remember Kalen screaming, then dissolving into a silhouette of static. I turned to run, but the corridor, it just kept going. I remember sprinting past the same atmospheric scrubber unit, over and over. Every time I passed it, the gravity shifted, or the air froze, or a fire erupted from nowhere. I was running, but I was not moving forward." Thalos turned away from the examination table. He extended a specialized data spike from his suit, plugging it directly into the battered black box module, salvaged from Orin's ruined environmental armor. The decryption software chewed through the corrupted code. "Let us look at the objective truth," Thalos murmured. A holographic projection flickered to life, displaying rows of chronological data. Thales highlighted the mission timer. Your total extravehicular operation, from the moment your airlock cycled to the moment you crashed into our emergency bay doors, lasted exactly 18 minutes. The doctor stated clearly. That is the absolute chronological truth recorded by the station master clock. He then brought up a second data stream, this one pulsing in organic crimson. However, your biological markers tell a radically different story. The muscular lactic acid buildup, the severe depletion of your adrenal glands, the precise degradation of your telomeres under acute stress. According to your own cellular clock, you have been in a state of maximum fight-or-flight survival for nearly 9 hours. Nima stepped forward, her large eyes fixed on the contradictory holograms. She rapidly tapped her diagnostic slate, layering Oren's injury reports over the chronological data. Her breath caught in her throat. "Dr. Vorn," she whispered, pointing a trembling finger at the breakdown. "Look at the tissue analysis. The cold radiation burns on his epidermis are acute, perhaps 30 minutes old. But the microfractures along his lumbar spine, the osteoblastic response there, indicates the bone has been trying to heal for at least 4 hours. The internal hemorrhaging in his liver shows coagulated layering that implies multiple blunt force traumas, separated by significant intervals of time." Nima looked at Oren, terrified. "These injuries did not happen at the same time. You were hurt. Then you survived for hours. Then you were hurt again. But you were only outside for 18 minutes. The implications hung in the sterile air, heavy and suffocating. Time inside the derelict had not just dilated, it had shattered, trapping the human in a localized cycle of recurring trauma." Suddenly, Oren seized the stainless steel railing of the examination bed. His knuckles turned stark white. His back arched off the padding, the ruined muscles straining against his own agonizing limits. His eyes went wide and utterly unfocused, staring straight through the ceiling of the medical bay. He let out a harsh, ragged gasp, like a drowning man breaking the surface of a frozen lake. "Mercer," Thales snapped, moving forward to secure him. "Are you experiencing a neural seizure?" Oren did not seem to hear him. His breathing was rapid, shallow, tearing through his throat. He stared at the empty space, terror etched deeply into every line of his face. He remembered. The pieces of the fragmented maze were slamming into place. "It is coming," Oren whispered, his voice trembling with a horrific certainty. "The cascade. It is going to happen here." Thales stopped. "What cascade?" Oren's eyes slowly refocused, locking onto the chief medical officer with a desperate intensity. "A chain reaction. It starts small. A minor medical incident in the biological containment wing. Just a distraction. Then the artificial intelligence network will suffer a localized routing error, blinding the internal sensors. Shortly after that, the primary cooling lines for the station core will collapse under the pressure differential." Nima dropped her slate. It clattered loudly on the floor. "That would trigger a catastrophic meltdown. Helix Gate would vaporize." "How could you possibly know the operational failure sequence of this specific station?" Thales demanded, his luminescent core flashing with defensive disbelief. "You are a civilian salvage engineer. You do not have access to our core architecture, nor can you predict random system failures." Oren released his death grip on the rail. His hand fell to his side, limp and defeated. He looked at the two aliens, his eyes carrying the weight of 100 failed lifetimes. "Because I have seen it happen," Oren replied, the absolute calm in his voice, sending a profound chill down the spines of his audience. "Many times." Before Thales could counter this impossible statement, the decryption terminal behind him emitted a sharp, high-pitched chime. The deep dive recovery software had finally managed to piece together a single, uncorrupted video frame from the absolute end of the suit's visual log, right before the recording hardware had been violently fused together. Thales turned and expanded the image. The medical bay went dead still. The holographic frame was heavily distorted, bleeding with chromatic aberration and static interference. It showed a section of the derelict's non-Euclidean corridor, bathed in a sickly, bending light that seemed to twist the very air. In the center of the frame stood Orrin Mercer. He was wearing his environmental suit, though the helmet visor was shattered, revealing his face. But he was not looking at the camera. He was looking directly forward, confronting another figure standing mere feet away. The second figure was also Orrin Mercer. The second Orrin was in vastly worse condition. His suit was shredded into useless ribbons. His face was a mask of congealed blood, one eye swollen shut, his mouth stretched wide in a frantic, desperate scream. There was no audio file attached to the frame, rendering the warning eternally silent. The second Orrin was reaching out, his hand practically touching the lens of the first Orrin's suit camera, trying to stop him from moving forward. Thalos stared at the impossible image, the visual proof of a temporal collapse, while the chilling reality of the human's words settled over the room like a burial shroud. Thalos Vorn reached a manipulator tendril toward the primary communications console and deliberately severed the automated uplink to the central command server. His digits moved with frantic, calculated precision, throwing up a heavy encryption wall around the local data cache of Trauma Bay 7. If station security saw that impossible video frame, Commander Sorek Dane would immediately flood the room with biochemical containment foam. They would drag the human into a deep quarantine black box, silencing him forever before Thalos could extract the necessary context. Nema watched him commit this blatant violation, her translucent green skin turning a sickly shade of pale yellow. Dr. Vorn, Standard Galactic Protocol mandates the immediate reporting of all Class 9 temporal hazards to the Central Authority. Standard Protocol, Thalos buzzed, his synthetic voice tight with unprecedented anxiety. Was written for a linear universe operating under predictable physics. We are currently standing inside a localized paradox. Thalos turned his attention back to the overarching resonance ring hovering above the examination table. He needed to understand the biomechanical engine driving this anomaly. He pulled up the cerebral map again, overlaying the repeating electrical scars with the chronological discrepancies of the human's physical trauma. Look at his synaptic firing rate, Thalos instructed the nurse, projecting the data into the center of the room. Under this sheer magnitude of uninterrupted agony, a standard organic processor should initiate a total systemic crash, an automatic, irreversible coma to protect the core consciousness. But his brain is actively refusing to shut down. The neural pathways are not just enduring the distress signals, they are gripping them. Nema frowned, her large eyes tracing the jagged red spikes of the biomonitor. Gripping them for what purpose? As a cognitive tether, Thalos replied, a profound sense of scientific awe creeping into his tone. In a localized space where time dilates, fractures, and loops upon itself, the concepts of past and future become entirely indistinguishable. The mind dissolves because it loses its sequential reference points. You cannot form a memory if the timeline constantly rewrites itself. But pain, pure physical trauma, is absolute. It is a harsh, inescapable biological present tense. Thalos looked down at the bleeding, shivering creature on his table. For a human, this level of suffering was not merely a symptom of catastrophic tissue damage. It was a brutal navigation tool. His nervous system was weaponizing the agony, utilizing the fire in his shattered leg and ruined spine as a heavy anchor to prevent his consciousness from disintegrating across the shifting temporal tides. Nema turned back to her environmental monitoring station, intending to check the ambient oxygen mix, but her fingers froze over the haptic interface. Dr. Vorn, please look at the station's ambient medical dampening field. Helix Gate, adhering to the highest premium standards of galactic medical facilities, constantly broadcast a low-frequency neural soothing wave through its primary ventilation architecture. It was designed to keep patients calm, lower baseline blood pressure, and mitigate low-level discomfort. It operated at a gentle frequency, completely harmless to 99% of all known sentient lifeforms. I am cross-referencing the station's soothing frequency with the biometric feedback from the black nanoscaffolding inside his bloodstream, Nima said, her voice dropping to a terrified whisper. The frequencies are violently clashing. The residual echo of that ancient machine inside his biology is treating our pain relief field as a hostile environmental intrusion. It is creating a severe, escalating neural resonance. Thalos stopped moving. The realization struck him with the force of a kinetic projectile. He looked at Orin, who was currently clenching his jaw with enough force to threaten the structural integrity of his teeth. That was the exact reason the human had so violently refused the deep anesthesia earlier. If Thalos flooded his circulatory system with heavy chemical numbing agents, the pain would vanish. But with the pain gone, the cognitive anchor would immediately snap. Orin would lose his iron grip on the current iteration of reality. He would slip backward into the psychological abyss of the time loops, utterly unable to distinguish the real, present, helix gate from the doomed, burning versions he had already lived through and died in. To anesthetize the human was to blind him entirely. Suddenly, the overhead intercom crackled to life. The stern, synthesized voice of the Central Command Artificial Intelligence echoed coldly through the medical bay. Attention all station personnel. Primary Command has authorized the immediate biometric sealing of the recovered salvage specimen, initiating partial evacuation protocols for Sector 4. All non-essential medical and engineering staff must relocate to the Central Civilian Hub immediately. Sealing sequence will commence in precisely 3 minutes. On the metal examination table, Orin forced himself upward, propping his weight onto his trembling elbows. The sudden, violent movement tore fresh, wet lines across his ruined chest plate, but his bloodshot eyes were fiercely lucid. "No!" Orin gritted out, spitting a mouthful of bloody saliva onto the pristine floor. "Bring up the station schematics. Do it right now." Thalos hesitated for only a fraction of a second before swiping his primary tendril across the console, projecting a massive, glowing blue architectural map of Helix Gate into the air between them. Orin squinted against the harsh light, his chest heaving irregularly as he scanned the complex, multi-layered web of corridors, life support arteries, and primary gravity generators. He raised a shaking, heavily armored finger and pointed toward a faint, narrow line, bypassing the main commercial thoroughfares on the lower decks. "Right there!" Orin rasped, his breathing ragged. "Auxiliary Maintenance Route 7. It runs directly beneath the main civilian promenades." "That is a low-traffic structural conduit," Thalos noted, analyzing the blueprint. "It is primarily utilized for automated ventilation scrubbers and secondary coolant lines. There is no personnel presence required." "If they lock down that specimen container using the standard containment grid right now," Orin said, his voice dropping into a register of pure, exhausted dread. "The energy field will act exactly like a tuning fork. It will bounce the anomaly's localized resonance directly into the station's power grid. If they do not sequence the purge valves in the exact right order, that specific auxiliary route is going to buckle under the strain. It will not just depressurize. The floor will turn into a localized gravity well. It will violently swallow everything in a 200-meter radius. Hundreds of people on the promenade above are going to be dragged down and crushed into a space the size of a standard cargo crate." Nima looked at the chief medical officer, her entire body trembling. The human was practically broken in half, his internal organs failing, his nerves actively burning themselves to ash, and he was raving about catastrophic events that had not yet occurred. Strict, established medical doctrine dictated that they strap him down to the table, pump him full of heavy sedatives, and completely ignore his trauma-induced psychosis for his own safety. "Doctor!" Nima whispered frantically. Command will strip your medical license and exile you if you interfere with a station-wide security protocol based solely on the paranoid delusions of a dying Deathworlder. Thylus looked at the glowing blue projection. He looked back at the human, a creature whose entire present existence violently defied the foundational laws of biology, time, and physics. Pull up the internal security camera feed for auxiliary maintenance Route 7, Thales commanded quietly. Nema hesitated, her fingers hovering over the glass, then tapped her console. A small, high-definition video window expanded next to the station map. The metallic corridor was entirely empty. It was dimly lit, silent, and completely normal. Then, the image rippled. It was a subtle, terrifying distortion, exactly like looking at the thick titanium walls through a heavy heat haze. The massive structural support beams lining the ceiling began to hum, vibrating fast enough to blur slightly on the visual feed. The heavy, artificial gravity plates bolted to the floor groaned in protest. A sickening sound, picked up by the audio sensors, that sounded absolutely identical to the violent torsion they had experienced in the medical bay just minutes prior. The anomaly was building its charge. The human was absolutely right. Thales Vorn, a creature forged by strict galactic logic, rigid operational protocols, and unwavering medical standards, faced the ultimate precipice of his long career. To his left lay the absolute safety of the established rules and the comfort of ignorance. To his right lay a bleeding, impossible, stubborn creature who was actively navigating an impending apocalypse by the solitary light of his own agonizing trauma. Thales reached out and permanently severed the electronic lock on the medical bay doors. He turned his luminous gaze to his nurse. "Override all the security lockouts on my mobile trauma unit," Thales ordered, his internal bioplasma burning a brilliant, resolute silver. "We are going to stop a massacre." The reinforced blast doors of Trauma Bay 7 did not simply open. They were aggressively overridden. Commander Sorek Dane strode into the room, flanked by two heavily armored tactical officers. Sorek was a Vraxian, a towering biped encased in natural obsidian chitin that scraped against his composite armor plates. He radiated the rigid, unyielding authority of a station security chief who viewed every anomaly as a target waiting for his kinetic hammer. "Dr. Vorn," Sorek barked, his mandibles clicking sharply. "Step away from the specimen. We are transferring him to a maximum security biological containment vault in Sector 9. On the examination table, Oren Mercer dragged his broken torso upward. The violent motion tore his freshly coagulated wounds wide open. Bright crimson spilled down his ribs, mingling with the black nanodust. He was not trying to flee. He was trying to reach the communications console. "Do not initiate the grid seal," Oren choked out, his voice a jagged rasp of tearing cartilage. "If you drop the heavy energy shields around that artifact, you trap the resonance feedback loop inside the hull. It always starts with the seal." Sorek did not even look at the human. "Secure him. Use the neural batons if he resists." The two guards stepped forward. "Halt!" Thales commanded. The chief medical officer moved his bulky biosuit directly between the heavily armed Vraxians and the bleeding Deathworlder. His internal plasma flared from a clinical azure into an aggressive, blinding ultraviolet, a biological warning display that made even the hardened guards pause. Sorek narrowed his multifaceted eyes. "You are interfering with a station-wide alpha protocol. Doctor, move." "I am exercising my overriding medical authority," Thales countered, his synthetic voice echoing with a metallic absolute. "The patient is unstable. Transporting him will cause immediate cessation of life functions. I require 20 minutes to verify a localized temporal diagnostic." 20 minutes, Sorek sneered, his mandibles vibrating with contempt. "The artifact in the salvage bay is emitting a frequency that is currently rewriting our localized physics. Your patient is suffering from acute, trauma-induced paranoia. It is a documented psychological break following severe, anomalous exposure. He is hallucinating. He is navigating, Thalos corrected sharply. He is a liability, Sorek snapped, reaching for his own restraint harness. And you are relieved of duty. The security chief took one step forward. Then, the medical bay went completely mad. It did not start with an explosion. It started with a whisper of corrupted data. The secondary medical artificial intelligence, the overarching system that passively monitored the telemetry of all 3,500 inhabitants on Helix Gate, suffered a catastrophic routing stroke. Every single diagnostic screen in the room flashed from sterile blue to a violent, pulsing red. The audio systems shrieked, layering hundreds of synthesized distress calls over one another. Cardiac arrest detected in Sector 2. The artificial intelligence droned in a rapid, overlapping loop. Spontaneous cellular combustion detected in Sector 4. Absolute zero body temperature detected in the civilian promenade. All vital signs terminal. All personnel deceased. It was a digital hallucination. The inhabitants were not dead, but the station's internal logic was fracturing, blinded by the anomaly's expanding shockwave. Oren slumped heavily against the steel incline of the bed. Sweat cut pale lines through the grime on his face. He stared at the flashing red alarms. "It is beginning," Oren breathed, the words barely carrying over the deafening sirens. "Nurse Sile," Thalos shouted over the noise. "Route the visual feed from the eastern civilian thoroughfare to the primary holographic projector." "Now!" Nima's fingers flew across her haptic pad, tearing the security feed away from the corrupted main hub and forcing it onto their local display. The air in the room seemed to freeze. On the massive projection, the wide, brightly lit eastern corridor was tearing itself apart without a single explosive charge. The localized artificial gravity was no longer failing. It was actively rippling. It looked exactly like a heavy stone had been dropped into a calm pond, but the medium was space-time itself. Invisible torsion waves rolled down the hallway, bending the thick titanium bulkheads inward, shattering the reinforced glass of the storefronts, and violently hurling structural debris into the air. The physical world was liquefying. It was exactly, down to the granular detail, what the broken human had warned them about just moments ago. Sorek stared at the feed, his mandibles frozen mid-click. His rigid galactic worldview was crumbling just as fast as the corridor on the screen. Thalos did not hesitate. The time for standard protocol had burned to ash. The chief medical officer turned to the examination table and ripped the heavy magnetic biorestraints off Oren's wrists and chest. He grabbed the synthesized neural dampeners he had prepared earlier and violently crushed the vial in his manipulator tendril, letting the precious painkillers spill uselessly onto the floor. He was committing to the madness. He was keeping the human awake. "Doctor," Sorek finally found his voice, turning back with absolute horror. "What are you doing? You cannot let a delirious Deathworlder off the table during a station collapse." "He is not delirious, Commander," Thalos replied, his glowing core pulsing with a terrifying, absolute calm. "He is the only individual on this station who has already lived through the next 10 minutes. We are going to let him lead." Oren did not waste time gloating. The agony radiating from his right leg was so intense, it was causing the blood vessels in his eyes to rupture, turning the whites a terrifying crimson. He gripped Thalos's armored shoulder for support, his breathing a rapid, wet staccato. "The primary automated fire suppression system in the adjacent maintenance block is going to try to compensate for the gravity shear." Oren ground out, his jaw locked tight against the pain. "It will pull power from the secondary plasma line, but the line is already cracked from the temporal stress." Oren pointed a trembling, blood-soaked finger at the tactical map hovering next to the security feed. "In exactly 14 seconds, that junction is going to blow out." Sorek looked at the map, then at the human, his military mind rejecting the impossibility of the prediction. That conduit is shielded by 10 inches of compressed carbon. It cannot just rupture from a power surge. 14, Orin whispered, closing his eyes as a new wave of localized agony racked his spine. 13. 12. The medical bay fell silent, save for the wailing alarms and the human's ragged breathing. Thalos watched the tactical readout. Nema clutched her slate to her chest. Sorek stood rigidly, his hand hovering over his sidearm. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. A concussive shockwave violently slammed into Trauma Bay 7, rattling the surgical tools on their trays and forcing Sorek to brace his heavy, chitinous legs to keep from falling over. On the tactical display, a massive red bloom erupted exactly where Orin had pointed, signifying a catastrophic plasma breach in the secondary line. The adjacent corridor feed instantly went black, consumed by raw energy. Sorek Dane, a veteran of 14 planetary skirmishes and the most unyielding security officer in the sector, stood in absolute, stunned silence. The sheer impossibility of the event stripped away his authority faster than any weapon could. Orin opened his bloodshot eyes. He looked at the Vraxian commander. "They always blow the plasma line, Commander," Orin said softly, his voice carrying the exhaustion of a ghost, forced to haunt his own death over and over again. "Now, unless you want the primary core to breach in the next 4 minutes, you are going to give Dr. Vorn complete tactical control of the lower decks." Sorek looked at the ruined, bleeding creature on the table. The Vraxian slowly lowered his hand from his weapon. He did not issue an order to his guards. He simply nodded once, stepping back. The dynamic in the room fundamentally shifted, pivoting on the axis of that single explosion. Orin Mercer was no longer a Class 9 medical emergency. He was no longer a patient strapped to a table waiting for salvation. Through the crucible of his own unrelenting, unmedicated agony, the human had just become the sole surviving witness to a disaster that had not yet finished killing them. And he was the only one who knew the way out of the slaughterhouse. "Doctor," Orin said, his voice dropping an octave, solidifying into pure, hardened steel. "Get me a mobile diagnostic rig and something to brace this dead leg. We are going into the core." Thalos Vorn did not possess a human heart, but as he worked to stabilize the shattered architecture of Orin Mercer's body, his bioelectric plasma hummed with a profound, unfamiliar sorrow. The chief medical officer moved with rapid, calculated grace, deploying a heavy biomechanical exoskeleton brace around the human's ruined right leg. He was actively ignoring the blaring alarms and the distant, muffled thuds of Helix Gate's secondary systems, failing one by one. They needed to move, but Thalos needed data first. He had to map the temporal labyrinth the human was trapped in. "Talk to me, Mercer," Thalos ordered, his synthetic voice softer now, lacking its usual clinical bite. He injected a localized cellular coagulant directly into the human's abdominal cavity to stall the internal bleeding. "I need to understand the variables you have already eliminated. How many iterations of this localized collapse have you experienced?" Orin gripped the edge of the examination table, his knuckles bone-white as the exoskeleton servos locked into his fractured tibia. He let out a harsh, shuddering breath. "I stopped counting after the first 2 dozen. The timeline always resets when I die, or when the primary core breaches. Whichever comes first." Nema Sile, hovering near the diagnostic terminal with the mobile rig, let out a soft, horrified click. "You have died 2 dozen times." "More," Orin rasped, his head falling back against the metal rest. He stared at the ceiling, though his eyes were focused on horrors only he could see. "At first, I tried the standard emergency protocols. I triggered the mass evacuation alarms the moment I staggered into the airlock. It caused a localized panic. The temporal anomaly caught up to the crowd in Sector 4. The gravity sheared. I watched 300 people get compressed into a fine red mist against the bulkhead." Thalos tightened a primary arterial clamp. "What else?" "I tried isolation," Oren continued, his voice monotone, detached. The sound of a mind actively walling off its own sanity to remain functional. "I managed to seal the salvage bay doors and overload the localized containment field. I thought I could cage it. The artifact resonated with the shield generators. The feedback loop shattered the entire lower hemisphere of the station. We all suffocated in the void." He coughed, spitting a streak of crimson onto his chest plate. "I even tried to destroy it," Oren whispered, a profound guilt bleeding into his tone. "I armed a heavy mining charge and threw it directly into the center of the arc. The explosion did not even scratch the surface. It just absorbed the kinetic energy and instantly flash-fried my nervous system. That is where the burns came from. And one time, just once, I tried to run. I stole a light shuttle and launched. The station core melted down behind me, and the shockwave caught my ship. I burned alive in the cockpit." Thalos paused his work, his glowing tendrils hovering over the open wounds. A terrifying realization locked into his analytical matrix. He looked at the deep, layered bruising on the human's torso, the fractal burn scars, the microfractures. "Flesh memories," Thalos breathed, the concept violating every law of linear biology he knew. "Your consciousness is snapping back to the point of initial entry, but your physical form is retaining a biological receipt of the trauma. The universe is forcing your current body to bear the chronological weight of your past deaths." Oren offered a weak, lopsided nod. "Every time I wake up in that airlock, there is a new broken bone, a new patch of dead nerves. I am running out of body, Doc. If we fail this time, there might not be enough of me left to wake up for the next loop." Thalos shifted his primary scanner to monitor the human's cerebral cortex. The readouts were a chaotic, violent storm of red spikes. The pain receptors were not just firing, they were screaming at maximum capacity. Thalos had assumed, based on the human's terrifying composure, that his species possessed some evolutionary mechanism to naturally dampen extreme neurological distress. He was wrong. The data proved it. Oren Mercer was feeling absolutely everything. Every shattered bone fragment grinding against muscle tissue, every dying nerve ending misfiring in his leg, every drop of freezing blood. The agony was not muted. It was apocalyptic. "You are not numb to this," Thalos stated, a sense of genuine awe coloring his synthetic tone. "Your nervous system is absorbing a lethal threshold of pain, yet you are maintaining cognitive cohesion." How Nima looked up from the glowing screen of her data slate. She had bypassed the locked central server to pull the human's complete background file, desperately searching for some biological anomaly to explain this monster on their table. "He is not military," Nima said softly, her large eyes wide with disbelief as she scrolled through the heavily redacted files. "Commander Dane assumed you were a special operations soldier due to your pain tolerance. But you are registered as a civilian salvage engineer, and before that, a deep space rescue technician for the Frontier Colonial Authority." Oren did not reply. He just focused on breathing through the tightening grip of the leg brace. Nima stepped closer, reading the glowing text aloud. "He was born on the outer mining colony of Aegis Prime, a hostile environment classification. The atmospheric toxicity is lethal, and the industrial accident rate is the highest in the sector. Dr. Vorn, look at his primary education records." Thalos glanced at the slate. The data was startling. In the wealthy, sheltered core worlds of the galaxy, children were taught advanced mathematics and arts. On Aegis Prime, the primary curriculum for a 6-year-old included applying arterial tourniquets, managing severe radiation burns, and operating heavy pneumatic jaws to pry open crushed bulkheads. They are taught how to bandage catastrophic wounds before they are taught how to read complex literature, Nima whispered, a profound shift occurring in her understanding of the creature before her. To the Sylphian nurse, who came from a world of soft winds and painless existence, trauma was the absolute end of a life. It was a reason to shut down and surrender. But to Orrin Mercer, forged in the brutal foundries of the galactic frontier, trauma was simply an environmental hazard. An injury was not a period at the end of a sentence. It was merely a comma. You patched the leak, you braced the broken bone, and you kept working, because stopping meant dying. He was a search and rescue specialist, Nima continued, her voice trembling with sudden, overwhelming respect. His operational record has 87 commendations for hazardous environment extractions. His unit motto translates directly to "no one left to the dark." That was why he had not run a second time. That was why he was actively letting the universe grind his body into bloody dust loop after loop. He was a rescue worker on a station with over 3,000 civilians. Leaving them behind was fundamentally incompatible with his core programming. Thalos locked the final servo on the leg brace. The heavy metal mechanism snapped into place with a loud, violent clack, driving a localized spike of pressure directly into the crushed tibia. Orrin violently gasped, his entire body arching as the sudden jolt of agony cut through the ambient haze. But the pain did not just hurt. It struck a tuning fork deep inside his overwritten brain. The sheer intensity of the neural spike shattered a mental block, violently dislodging a crucial, suppressed memory from the derelict ship. Orrin's eyes shot wide open. His pupils dilated until they swallowed the irises entirely. "The core!" Orrin choked out, grabbing Thalos by the armored wrist. His grip was suddenly terrifyingly strong, fueled by a massive adrenaline surge. "The machine in the center. I remember what happened when Kalen touched it." Thalos leaned in, entirely focused. "Tell me." "It did not attack him," Orrin said, the words tumbling out in a frantic, desperate rush. "We thought it was a defense mechanism. We thought it was a weapon or a malfunctioning reactor. But when Kalen touched the Ark, the machine did not strike him. It scanned him. It sent a massive, instantaneous neural ping through his biology to test his durability." Orrin swallowed hard, the horrific truth finally aligning in his mind. Kalen dissolved because his nervous system instantly overloaded and vaporized under the pressure of the scan. He failed the triage. "The machine is not a weapon. Doc, it is a medical diagnostic terminal from a dead civilization. A civilization that survived extreme dimensional disasters." Nema dropped her slate. Thalos's internal plasma flared bright white. The implications were staggering. The alien artifact was not a hostile entity trying to destroy Helix Gate. It was an automated, ancient trauma center that had drifted into the rift, blindly trying to perform intake on a sinking ship. But its methods were designed for a species so biologically dense and durable that a standard galactic lifeform evaporated upon contact. "It uses pure pain as a baseline diagnostic tool," Orrin whispered, staring at his own trembling, nano-infused hands. "It floods the subject with agony to map out their neural capacity. If you shatter, you are classified as terminal and discarded. If you survive the ping, you are classified as compatible." Thalos looked at the black, shifting virostructures webbing beneath the human's pale skin, the nanoscaffolding holding his broken spine together. "You survived the initial contact," Thalos realized, his voice hollow with the weight of the revelation. "Your human pain threshold, your stubborn refusal to die, kept you conscious just long enough for the machine to finish its scan." "It did not attack me," Orrin confirmed, a bitter, exhausted smile touching his torn lips. "It admitted me as a patient. It thinks I am its operator. It bound my nervous system to its core architecture to keep me alive. That is why the pain shifts. It is the machine trying to tell me where the station is bleeding." The twist hung in the air, brilliant and terrible. The apocalypse tearing Helix Gate apart was not an act of malice. It was a catastrophic medical error caused by an ancient machine trying to heal a station that could not survive its brutal cure. And the only interface capable of communicating with it was a broken human who had to stay awake through the fire to translate the diagnosis. Thalos Vorn plunged his primary cognitive tendrils deeper into the decrypted architecture of the alien data stream. The localized network of Trauma Bay 7 Word, processing the ancient, alien algorithms that Orin had unwittingly dragged back from the void. The chief medical officer bypassed the encrypted firewalls of the salvaged black box, delving into the raw telemetry of the artifact itself. The holographic display shifted from the red topography of Orin's ruined anatomy to a sprawling, starlit projection of an ancient technological paradigm. The truth blossomed in the center of the room, immense and humbling. This was not merely a diagnostic tool. The arc-shaped machine was the heart of a macro-triage system, a colossal biomedical station engineered by a civilization that had likely gone extinct eons before the first human struck two stones together to make fire. It was designed to pull dying starships back from the brink of absolute dimensional annihilation. But its methodology was terrifyingly symbiotic. The system could not operate in a vacuum. To repair a failing superstructure, it required a living, biological conduit capable of absorbing the vessel's catastrophic damage as a direct sensory feed. A pain map. The machine was actively translating the tearing titanium, the rupturing plasma conduits, and the failing gravity plating of Helix Gate into sheer neurological agony, broadcasting it directly into the human's central nervous system. For any known galactic species, receiving a localized telemetry burst of a collapsing space station would instantly liquefy their cerebral cortex. It would induce total paralytic death within a fraction of a second. But Orin was a Deathworlder. His primitive, hyper-resilient nervous system did not shatter. It merely screamed. He was enduring the architectural death of an entire orbital facility, processing the station's structural failures as continuous, violent chains of physical torment, yet somehow remaining above the threshold of cognitive collapse. Thalos magnified the black, geometric particulate matter surging through the human circulatory system. The realization struck with cold, clinical dread. "These are not simply splints," Thalos declared, the synthesized voice heavy with the weight of the discovery. "They are advanced biomedical nanoscaffolds. The ancient system is actively trying to keep its biological interface alive. It is synthesizing these structures from the ambient carbon in your suit and injecting them into your bloodstream to prevent your flesh from disintegrating under the sheer pressure of the resonance." Orin leaned heavily against the examination table, his breath rattling in his throat. "So it is fixing me." "It is fortifying you," Thalos corrected sharply, "but the process is parasitic. To withstand the escalating dimensional resonance, the nanoscaffolding is actively replacing your organic myelin sheaths with silicate-based minerals. It is calcifying your nervous system to make it conductive enough to handle the load. You are surviving through a miracle of ancient science, Mercer. But if this resonance continues for another 2 hours, the mineralization will become permanent. You will be permanently locked inside a petrified nervous system. True, irreversible paralysis." Before anyone could process the horror of that ticking clock, the air in the medical bay visibly warped. Commander Sorik Dane suddenly staggered backward, his multifaceted eyes widening in absolute shock. A translucent, flickering silhouette of himself, rendered in perfect, ghostly detail, walked right past his current position, heading toward the sealed blast doors. The phantom Vraxian reached the doorway, hesitated for 2 seconds, and then dissolved into a shower of localized static. "Nema!" Scylla let out a sharp cry as she watched her own echo reach for a medical slate she had already dropped a minute ago. "Time lag shadows," Thalos observed, his bioplasma flickering erratically. "The temporal integrity of the station is unraveling faster than anticipated. We are beginning to overlap with our own immediate pasts. The spatial fabric is tearing." Sorik straightened his posture, shaking off the existential dread of watching his own ghost. The rigid security commander finally accepted the terrifying reality. Standard protocols were dead. Firepower was useless against a collapsing timeline. He stepped toward the examination table, his mandibles twitching. "What is the tactical objective?" "Human," Sorik demanded, his voice devoid of its former arrogance. "Tell me exactly how we stop this." Orin dragged his gaze away from the shifting temporal echoes. He pointed a trembling, heavily armored finger at the glowing blueprints hovering above the console. "We have to sever the connection," Orin rasped, forcing the words through a clenched jaw. "The ancient machine is trying to heal the station, but its broadcast is violently clashing with Helix Gate's environmental soothing field. The two frequencies are grinding against each other, tearing the space-time continuum apart. We need to physically enter the primary harmonic conduit channel, right above the central core, and manually decouple the station's neurological dampeners from the main power grid. If we kill the soothing field, the artifact stops trying to fight it. The resonance loop breaks." Thalos instantly rejected the proposition. "Absolutely out of the question. The harmonic conduit channel is the focal point of the temporal friction. It is currently acting as an amplifier for the artifact's diagnostic broadcast. The area is saturated with raw neural pain pulses. The ambient agony radiation is so dense that any alien life form within a radius of 30 meters will suffer immediate, catastrophic synaptic failure. You would all collapse before you even reach the access hatch." The medical bay fell silent. The wailing of the distant alarms seemed to amplify in the heavy void of that pronouncement. It was a suicide run into a wall of invisible fire. Orin did not look surprised. He did not look afraid. He merely reached down, gripping the cold titanium of the mechanical exoskeleton, clamped to his ruined right leg. He locked the knee joint into place with a heavy, metallic thud. He looked directly at the chief medical officer, his eyes burning with the grim, unyielding resolve of a man who had already died in the dark too many times to fear it anymore. "Then it is just me," Orin stated simply. He began to push himself off the table, preparing to drag his broken body into the epicenter of a localized apocalypse. Thalos rapidly cross-referenced the human's current biometrics with the projected environmental hazards of the conduit channel. The internal simulation ran 1,000 permutations in a fraction of a second. The results flashed across his internal matrix, cold and undeniable. The chief medical officer reached out, wrapping a luminous, heavy tendril around Orin's shoulder, forcefully stopping his forward momentum. "You cannot go alone," Thalos buzzed, the pitch of his voice dropping into a register of grim finality. Orin glared at him. "You just said the ambient pain will kill anyone else who gets near that door." "Doc." "It will," Thalos confirmed. "But the manual decoupling of the harmonic conduit requires precise synchronization with the artifact's wavelength. You cannot simply smash the control panel. The frequency must be matched and inverted. As you approach the core, the pain map will escalate exponentially. You will be entirely consumed by the physical trauma. Your cognitive functions will narrow to a single point of agony. You will be completely incapable of reading the telemetry or adjusting the biological oscillations in real time." Nema realized what the doctor was saying before the human did. Her translucent skin turned entirely white. Thalos met Orin's bloodshot gaze. "A solitary operative cannot complete the surgical extraction of the frequencies. The patient requires a surgeon. You need a doctor to monitor the terminal, read your shifting biorhythms, and manually guide the decoupling process while you hold the line." The twist hung over them like a descending blade. The human had the sheer, monstrous durability to survive the ambient hellfire of the conduit, but he lacked the cognitive clarity to defuse the bomb. And the alien doctor had the necessary intellect and precision, but possessed a nervous system that would violently shut down the moment he crossed the threshold. To save Helix Gate, the dying human could not walk alone. He needed an anchor, and the anchor was going to have to walk directly into the fire with him. The luminescent currents within Thalos Vorn shifted into a turbulent, chaotic storm of deep violet and bruised purple. To be a chief medical officer in the Galactic Commonwealth was to adhere strictly to the principle of biological preservation. The doctrine was absolute do no harm, prevent self-destruction, and prioritize the immediate physiological stability of the patient above all external variables. Yet, the universe had trapped him in a paradox where adhering to his sacred oath would guarantee the annihilation of over 3,000 lives, including the patient himself. To send Oren Mercer into the harmonic conduit was to actively weaponize his suffering. It went against centuries of refined, painless galactic medical philosophy. Nurse Nima Sile broke the heavy silence. Her voice, usually a soft, trembling chime, possessed a new, desperate edge. She had been staring at the mobile diagnostic rig, her large eyes darting between the overarching scanner and the terrifying telemetry of the temporal distortion. "Dr. Vorn," Nima began, her hands hovering over the haptic interface. "If the localized pain radiation is going to blind your cognitive functions, and the human lacks the medical expertise to decouple the frequencies, we must merge the two capabilities. We cannot use chemical anesthetics on him, or he loses his anchor. But what if we do not just monitor his trauma? What if we harness it?" Thalos turned his optical receptors toward her, his plasma flaring. "Explain your hypothesis, nurse." "We use the mobile trauma unit's neural uplink," Nima said, her fingers moving rapidly across the console to draft a theoretical schematic. "We take the raw, agonizing sensory input from his central nervous system and route it directly into the rig's navigation matrix. We translate his physical pain into a topological map of the temporal friction. He becomes the living diagnostic probe. You follow the data stream he generates in real time, staying just far enough behind his localized interference field to maintain your own cognitive cohesion, and you guide his hands through the decoupling sequence." The medical bay grew terrifyingly quiet. The proposition was not just unorthodox. It was a profound violation of galactic medical ethics. Using a sentient patient as a living, suffering piece of diagnostic hardware was unprecedented. It was barbaric. Before Thalos could articulate a rejection based on standard protocol, a heavy, armored hand slammed against the examination table. "Do it," Oren Mercer commanded. His voice was a ragged saw, stripped of all bravado and left with nothing but cold, hardened utility. Thalos looked at the human. "Mercer, you do not comprehend the scale of this procedure. We would be stripping away all our passive filters. Every microtear in the station's hull, every fluctuation in the gravity plating, will be fed directly into your cerebral cortex. The agony will not just be localized to your physical injuries. You will feel the station dying." "I already feel it, Doc," Oren gritted out, dragging his reinforced leg off the side of the table. "I have felt it every single time this loop resets. I know exactly what happens if we stand here debating morality. The core breaches. The promenade collapses. We all burn. Plug the damn sensors in." Commander Sorek Dane stepped forward. The massive Vraxian security chief, a creature of absolute rules and rigid enforcement, reached up and unlatched his heavy tactical visor. He looked at the broken human, then at the glowing alien doctor. He had spent his entire career imposing order through force, but brute force could not shoot a hole in a collapsing timeline. Sorek activated his wrist-mounted command console. His mandibles clicked in a rapid sequence of authorization codes. "Central AI," Sorek announced, his voice echoing through the compromised intercom system. "This is Commander Dane. Alpha Protocol Override. Cancel the biological containment warrant for the human salvage engineer. Unlock all heavy blast doors between Trauma Bay 7 and the primary harmonic conduit. Reroute all remaining auxiliary power to the mobile trauma unit's energy reserves." The security chief looked directly at Thalos. "The security cordons are down, Doctor. I am transferring absolute tactical authority of the lower core sectors to you. Do not let this station fall." Thalos Vorn, a healer who despised reckless improvisation, felt the crushing weight of command settle over his pressurized suit. He gave a single, sharp nod. The rules of the galaxy no longer applied here. They were operating in the dark. "Nurse Sile," Thalos ordered, his internal light solidifying into a harsh, brilliant white. "Prepare the neural uplink patches. Maximum conductivity." As Nema scrambled to gather the heavy, multi-pronged sensor pads, Orin reached down to adjust the biomechanical exoskeleton locked around his right leg. He frowned, his bloodshot eyes narrowing as his fingers clumsily fumbled with the titanium clasps. He struck his own thigh with a closed fist. The sound was a dull, sickening thud of dead meat hitting metal. "Doc," Orin said, his breathing shallow. "The pain in my calf. It is gone. The knee is fading too. It just feels heavy." Thalos immediately ran a localized diagnostic sweep over the limb. The holographic projection confirmed his worst fear. The black, shifting virostructures inside the human's bloodstream had fundamentally altered their behavior. They were no longer just acting as a temporary splint. "The nanoscaffolding is advancing to the next phase," Thalos stated, offering no comforting lies. "The artifact senses the escalating temporal pressure and is aggressively hardening your neural pathways to prevent a total blowout. The silicate mineralization is solidifying. You are losing sensory input because your nerves are literally turning to stone." Orin stared at his dead leg. "How long until it reaches my spine?" "At the current rate of acceleration, perhaps 45 minutes. Thalos replied clinically, though his biocurrents betrayed a deep empathy. "I must be entirely transparent with you, Mercer. Even if we succeed, even if we decouple the frequencies and save Helix Gate, the calcification process might be irreversible. The structural damage to your lower nervous system is catastrophic. You may never walk normally again." The silence that followed was heavier than the failing gravity. It was the absolute, crushing reality of the toll this universe demanded. Orin slowly lifted his head. He looked at the flashing red emergency lights, listening to the distant, muffled screams of tearing metal echoing through the station's dying bones. He thought of the 3,000 civilians huddled in the central hub, completely unaware of the temporal fire racing toward them. "As long as this station still has people left to walk on it," Orin said softly, his voice devoid of regret. "That is enough for me." Nema stepped forward, clutching a tangled bundle of thick, bioconductive sensor cables. For the entirety of her career, she had maintained a strict, clinical distance from her patients. She was terrified of human physiology, repulsed by the wet, fragile, aggressively bleeding nature of their bodies. They were too loud, too violent, too stubborn. But as she looked at Orin Mercer, she did not see a terrifying Deathworlder. She saw a profoundly exhausted man willing to sacrifice his own mobility to buy time for strangers. Nema bypassed the automated mechanical arms of the trauma unit. She stepped directly into Orin's personal space. With trembling hands, she reached out and pressed the primary neural interface pad directly against his bare, blood-streaked neck. Her semi-translucent green fingers firmly gripped his shoulder, holding the sensor tightly in place while the microneedles engaged his spinal column. It was a minor, procedural gesture, but in the sterile, touch-averse culture of her species, it was a monumental crossing of boundaries. She did not flinch away from the heat of his fevered skin or the harsh copper smell of his blood. "I have synchronized the uplink," Nema whispered, her voice surprisingly steady. "I will monitor the biorhythms from the trailing console. I will not let you drown in the data stream. Orin." Orin looked at the small alien nurse, a genuine, tired smile cracking through the grime on his face. "Thanks, Nema. Keep a tight grip on the leash." Thalos detached the heavy mobile trauma unit from the wall alcove. The machine hummed to life, its anti-gravity repulsors whining against the unstable ambient fields of the room. A thick, glowing blue tether ran directly from the machine's core to the sensor cluster embedded in the back of Orin's neck. "The path is clear," Thalos announced. "We move now." The reinforced doors of Trauma Bay 7 hissed open, revealing a corridor bathed in the sickly, strobing red light of the emergency klaxons. The air outside tasted of burning ozone and ruptured coolant lines. The station groaned, a colossal beast dying in the dark. They stepped over the threshold, a luminescent alien doctor operating entirely outside his ethical programming, a fragile nurse confronting the terrifying realities of physical trauma, and a shattered, bleeding human engineer acting as the living compass for a disaster they could barely comprehend. Together, the three of them began the long, agonizing descent toward the harmonic conduit, walking side by side into the gaping mechanical throat of a scientific nightmare. The heavy blast doors of the harmonic conduit slid open, not with a mechanical hiss, but with a sickening, organic squelch. The air inside the corridor was no longer a breathable mixture of oxygen and nitrogen. It was a dense, vibrating fluid of kinetic potential. The titanium walls and the heavy grated floor plates had lost their rigid atomic structure. They heaved and contracted, expanding in a terrifying, rhythmic pulse that perfectly matched the accelerated, panicked heartbeats of the organic beings walking through the threshold. Commander Sorik Dane had deployed two of his most hardened Vraxian Vanguard officers to secure the perimeter. They crossed the threshold first, their heavy kinetic rifles raised. They lasted exactly 4 steps. The invisible, crushing wave of ambient neurological agony radiated outward from the core. It slammed into the chitinous bodies of the alien guards. Both elite soldiers immediately dropped their weapons and collapsed, their mandibles locked in wide, silent screams. Their central nervous systems had been instantly overloaded by a mere fraction of the ancient artifact's diagnostic broadcast, rendering them completely comatose before they even hit the deck. Only Thalis Vorn remained upright. The chief medical officer had dialed his built-in medical neural amplifier to maximum output, projecting a localized cognitive shield that barely kept the cascading pain signals from frying his own luminescent plasma core. Nima Sile survived by walking directly inside his protective shadow, her hands white-knuckled as she pushed the hovering mobile trauma unit forward. But Orin Mercer had no shield. He was the living antenna. The thick, bioconductive tether connecting the back of Orin's neck to the diagnostic rig pulsed with a blinding blue light. He dragged his heavy, exoskeleton-braced leg across the undulating floor. "Which way?" Thalis demanded, his synthetic voice straining against the heavy static charge in the air. Orin paused at a massive junction. He closed his eyes, mapping the fire inside his own flesh. A sudden, blinding spike of agony flared behind his right lung, sharp enough to make him choke on his own breath. The sensation was not a dull ache. It was the distinct feeling of structural tearing. "Right," Orin rasped, pointing down a branching maintenance corridor that looked physically identical to the others. "The rift is thinning over there. The pressure is higher." Every time he made a directional call, the toll was exacted in his flesh. As he pointed to the right, the black nanoscaffolding beneath his skin violently expanded. The geometric, obsidian virostructures broke the surface of his epidermis, crawling up his forearm and wrapping around his throat like a web of petrifying frost. His skin was actively turning into hardened silicate armor to keep his vascular system from bursting under the dimensional gravity. Every step was turning him into a living fossil. They breached the primary containment chamber, the absolute heart of Helix Gate. The massive cavern of humming plasma lines and towering coolant silos was currently twisted into a non-Euclidean nightmare. The space was bending inward. Holographic data streams from an extinct civilization were violently overwriting the station's physical operating system, projecting golden, alien geometries over the failing titanium bulkheads. Thalis connected his primary manipulator tendril directly to the central diagnostic terminal, his biocurrents flashing as he read the corrupted code. "It is not a technical malfunction," Thalis declared, shouting over the deafening roar of grinding metal and venting gases. The ancient artifact is attempting to execute a system-wide rescue protocol. It is analyzing the temporal shear and trying to fold the station's architecture into a dimensional life raft based on the logic of its creators. But our structural alloys and power grids are entirely incompatible. It is trying to heal the station by breaking its bones into a shape that fits a dead universe. Nima stared at the twisting pillars of the room. How do we stop an automated medical procedure? We have to perform a simultaneous system surgery, Thales commanded, mapping out the suicidal triage on the main display. 3 precise operations, executed perfectly in tandem. Step 1. I will sever the station-wide environmental soothing field at the root, blinding the artifact's primary conflict trigger. Step 2. Nurse Sile. You must use the trauma unit to calibrate the station's resonance rhythm to match the localized dimensional baseline. We have to harmonize the heartbeat. Thales looked at the towering manual regulator port at the far end of the chamber. It was glowing with a harsh, radioactive violet aura, vibrating violently against its moorings. Step 3 is the manual override, the doctor continued, his voice dropping. Someone must open the primary discharge vent to flush the built-up temporal energy directly out into the glass rift. But the vent requires continuous physical contact to cycle the massive physical valves. The feedback loop will route the entire station's pain pulse directly through the operator. The energy spike will incinerate the nerve endings of any organic being upon contact. Oren did not hesitate. He limped toward the glowing port. His right leg was completely dead now, dragging behind him like a slab of solid concrete, the nano-scaffolding having fully calcified the limb. He raised his left hand. The skin was already mapped with black, crystalline veins. "Get to your stations," the human ordered, his voice a hollow echo of a man who had already accepted his grave. Nima locked her trembling hands onto the trauma terminal. Thales buried his tendrils deeply into the primary interface matrix. Oren slammed his bare palm against the glowing regulator port. The reaction was instantaneous and apocalyptic. Oren's entire body went absolutely rigid, locking into a violent, sustained convulsion. A low, guttural roar tore from his throat, a sound of absolute, unfiltered torment that cut through the mechanical chaos of the room. On Nima's trailing console, the medical telemetry exploded into a chaotic flurry of critical red warnings. "Doctor!" Nima shrieked, her voice cracking as she watched the data stream. "His motor functions below the lumbar region. The neurons are flash calcifying at a catastrophic rate. He is passing the threshold of permanent damage. If he does not let go, his lower spine will turn to solid mineral. He will be crippled forever." Thales looked up from his interface, watching the human vibrate with the kinetic force of a dying star. The overarching medical oath screamed in the doctor's mind. "Mercer!" Thales roared over the din. "Break contact! Pull your hand away! We are losing your physiological integrity. You are destroying yourself." Oren tried to shake his head, but his neck muscles were locking down. He stared straight ahead at the highly polished, reflective titanium surface of the console panel directly above the port. In the warped metal, he saw it, a new time-lag shadow. It was a ghost of himself, doing exactly what the alien doctor ordered. In the reflection, his phantom hand pulled away from the port, breaking the circuit. The moment the contact was severed, the reflection showed the primary core containment dome violently cracking open, unleashing a blinding, expanding wave of hyperheated plasma that instantly vaporized the entire room. Oren knew the math of the disaster perfectly. If he let go now, the core explosion would trigger in exactly 23 seconds. Every civilian huddled in the upper decks would be reduced to atomic ash. "No," Oren choked out. Blood poured freely from his nose and ears, dripping heavily onto the pristine metal of the console. He pressed his hand harder against the burning plate, his knuckles turning white beneath the encroaching black crystal. The sheer, unfathomable magnitude of the neurological overload finally breached his highest cognitive pathways. The harsh red and violet lights of the core chamber began to fracture in his vision, splitting into jagged streaks of static. The static thickened, consuming the edges of his sight, and then began to fade rapidly into an absolute, suffocating black. Temporary blindness crashed down on him as his optic nerves simply surrendered to the fire, unable to process the sheer volume of sensory destruction. He could no longer see the terminal. He could no longer see the glowing blue tether, the alien doctor, or the terrified nurse. He could only feel the burning metal beneath his hand, hear the deafening roar of the apocalypse, and listen to the frantic voice of Nima Sile reading the manual override gauge. "The vent is opening," Nima cried out into the dark, her voice a desperate, pleading anchor in the chaos. But it is too slow. The regulator port is only at 62%. The absolute darkness surrounding Oren Mercer was not empty. It was a sensory void filled with a terrifying, crushing pressure. The neural overload had completely burned out his optic nerves, leaving him blind. But the agonizing telemetry of Helix Gate tearing itself apart continued to flood directly into his mind. He was drowning in the mechanical screams of the collapsing station. Thalis Vorn watched the human's vital signs flatlining across the diagnostic rig. The galactic standard of medicine dictated immediate intervention, sever the connection, flood the brain with heavy sedatives, and save the individual flesh at the cost of the surrounding environment. But as the chief medical officer stared at the chaotic bioelectric feed, a profound paradigm shift shattered his foundational programming. Galactic medicine had spent millennia treating pain strictly as an enemy, a biological malfunction to be instantly eradicated. But for the broken, bleeding creature holding the core together, the agony was not a symptom. It was a language. It was the only sonar they had in this lightless, temporal ocean. Thalis made his choice. He reached into the mobile trauma unit's primary interface and violently inverted the medical protocols. "Nurse Sile," Thalis commanded, his synthetic voice cutting through the deafening roar of grinding titanium and venting gases. "Do not suppress his neural spikes. Route the raw pain telemetry directly into the overarching navigation matrix. We are not going to numb him. We are going to read him." "I am blind, Doc," Oren gasped, his vocal cords tearing with the effort of speaking through the sustained electrocution. "You do not need eyes, Mercer," Thalis replied, his glowing tendrils flying across the console, synchronizing the alien artifact's diagnostic frequency with the human's suffering in real time. "Tell me exactly what the station is feeling. Translate the fire for us." Oren gritted his teeth, his head thrown back against the invisible, crushing weight of the dimensional shear. "There is a screaming point. High up on the left side of my chest. It feels like a drill." "Vector 3. Upper quadrant is compressing," Thalis called out, manually adjusting the station's dimensional dampeners to relieve the pressure. "Now it is cold," Oren choked out, his chest heaving violently. "A freezing, heavy wave running straight down my lower ribs, tearing the muscle." "Coolant line fracture on the secondary axis," Nima yelled over the sirens, her translucent hands blurring over the dials to match the restorative rhythm to the exact millisecond Oren described. "Compensating now." They pushed the massive valve higher, guided entirely by a map drawn in human suffering. 70%, 75%, 80%. At exactly 87%, the dying core of Helix Gate fought back. A massive, localized temporal backlash surged through the chamber. The kinetic shockwave violently threw Nima backward, hurling her lightweight body away from the console and slamming her against a titanium bulkhead. Thalis shrieked in sudden, synthetic agony as a surge of raw, untethered resonance fed back through his interface, permanently burning out the secondary neural pathways of his biosuit. At the epicenter of the blast, Oren absorbed the absolute brunt of the kinetic fury. The skin on his left hand still locked onto the regulator port, physically cracked. Deep, jagged fissures opened along the length of each finger. Bright, crimson blood instantly boiling into steam as it hit the superheated metal. Thales, struggling to maintain his footing, looked at the final decryption of the artifact's core data streaming across his compromised visor. The ultimate truth of the ancient machine finally laid itself bare. It was never a weapon. It was never even a test of sheer biological density. It was a localized medical tool engineered by a dying civilization specifically for the end of the world. It was designed to seek out the one biological trait capable of pulling a society back from total annihilation, the willingness to act as a sacrificial conduit. It was meant for a species stubborn enough to burn themselves alive, so that others might not feel the fire. "It is stalling!" Orin roared, his voice barely a human sound anymore. "The valve is stuck. Overload the primary discharge vent. Do it now." Thales stared at the terminal. "If I open the floodgates manually, the final pulse will route directly through your point of contact. It will strike your already compromised nervous system with the force of a localized supernova. It will finish breaking you." Orin turned his blind, bleeding face toward the glowing alien doctor. "Open the vent, Thales." For exactly one heartbeat, Thales Vorn hesitated. His entire existence had been defined by pulling patients away from the precipice of suffering. But as he looked at the human, he understood the ultimate lesson of a Deathworlder's biology. Sometimes, saving a patient was not about wrapping them in a sterile, painless bubble. Sometimes, it was about showing absolute reverence for the burden they had chosen to bear, and honoring their sacrifice by letting them finish the job. Thales slammed his primary tendril down onto the manual override. The regulator port hit 100%. A blinding, silent shockwave of pure, crystalline energy erupted from the core, ripping through the harmonic conduit and blasting violently outward into the starry abyss of the glass rift. The overwhelming temporal pressure instantly shattered. The non-Euclidean angles of the room violently snapped back into standard galactic geometry. The terrifying gravity shears across the station smoothed out, shrinking rapidly and sealing themselves shut, exactly like a properly sutured wound. Helix Gate stopped screaming. The magnetic lock on the regulator port disengaged. Orin Mercer's body went entirely limp, falling backward like a felled tree. He hit the cold titanium floor with a heavy, lifeless thud. His right leg did not twitch. His chest was terrifyingly still. The pulse monitor on the trauma unit emitted a continuous, flat tone. Thales and a bruised, limping Nema rushed to his side. But before the doctor could initiate emergency resuscitation, he noticed the biological anomaly. The black, geometric nanoscaffolding that had been aggressively petrifying Orin's skin was losing its structural integrity. The obsidian veins were dissolving, melting away into harmless carbon dust. The ancient triage system had successfully purged the temporal infection from the station. The treatment was complete, and the parasitic interface immediately ceased its consumption of the human's nervous system. 4 standard galactic days later. The air inside Trauma Bay 7 was quiet, smelling of sterile synthesizers rather than burnt ozone and blood. Orin Mercer slowly opened his eyes. The harsh emergency lighting had been replaced by a soft, warm amber glow. He tried to shift his weight and immediately gasped as a dull, heavy ache radiated from his chest to his toes. But it was just an ache. It was not the apocalyptic fire of the temporal rift. He looked down. His right leg was encased in a massive, heavy regenerative cast. He could not move it. Not yet. But the monitor above his bed showed a faint, stubborn pulse of neural regeneration where the silicate had been purged. The damage was profound, but the galactic medical databases had never accounted for the sheer, unreasonable regenerative capacity of a human. He had a chance to walk again. Thales Vorn glided into the room, his bioelectric plasma humming a calm, steady cerulean blue. He held a digitized medical slate in his manipulator tendril. Nima, Sile followed closely behind, carrying a tray of synthesized nutrients, her face breaking into an expression of profound relief. "Welcome back to a linear timeline, Mercer," Thalos buzzed, adjusting the incline of the bed. Orin offered a weak, lopsided smile, his throat dry. "Did we lose anyone on the promenade?" "Doc, 0 casualties," Thalos confirmed, looking directly at the human. "Commander Dane is currently writing a commendation that is long enough to span the entire length of the rift. And I am finalizing an updated physiological report for the Central Medical Commonwealth regarding human biology." Thalos looked down at the glowing text on his slate. He had spent the last 72 hours redefining everything he knew about life, survival, and the mechanics of pain. He had deleted the standard, dismissive entries regarding Deathworlders and replaced them with a truth forged in the crucible of the harmonic conduit. Orin closed his eyes, finally allowing himself the luxury of a deep, uninterrupted breath. Thalos transmitted the report to the galactic network. The final paragraph glowed brightly on the screen, a testament to the bleeding, broken creature lying in the bed. "Humans are not a species that disregards injury. They are a species that can walk through injury when someone else needs to be saved." Thank you so much for listening to this story. Where are you tuning in from today? Please drop a comment below so we can connect and share our thoughts on the universe. Don't forget to subscribe to Sci-fi Stories, like this video, and hit the hype button to help this story reach even more listeners across the galaxy.